Now, I Communicate continues on Full Service Radio, 830 WCRN. Once again, here's your host, Mark Altman.
Welcome back to the Mindset Go radio show. Hope you're having a great Thursday afternoon. Really happy to be here and love this topic of trust, because when we talk about things in the workplace like influence, persuasion, leadership, it all comes down, every relationship comes down to trust. And when I think of all the things that can degrade or lessen a relationship, once you lose trust and once you don't trust that fellow man or woman, it really impacts your ability, A, to be emotionally intelligent in that relationship, but B, to do all the things you need to do in the workplace, is be productive, be collaborative, actively listening, because once you start to doubt the other person, it impacts all of those things. So the second element of trust that's really important is being consistent. And when it comes to consistency, what I find interesting about that is part of being emotionally intelligent is being mindful and being self-aware and being able to regulate your emotions and feelings so you can establish that consistency. And a lot of times what happens is, and look, none of us are perfect, we're all flawed, but what it comes down to is if there's every 4 scenarios, you have an opportunity to follow through and be consistent, and you follow through on 2 or 3 of them, then it's the 1 or 2 that you don't follow through that people are going to pay more attention to. For example, there have been a lot of studies done that for every negative comment or piece of criticism in life, you need 7 positives for someone to cancel out the negative, because they're so focused and honed in on the negative. So here are some questions I always ask leaders when it comes to being consistent. How committed are you to keeping your obligations? And what does that mean, how committed? I mean, are you consistent? If you say you're going to do something, do you actually do it? All of the time, most of the time, some of the time, or rarely? I think of things, what are your choices for your employees to hold them accountable for their commitments? So if they're not keeping their commitments, I mean, I have clients all the time saying, I give our staff things to do and they don't do it, and I don't really have the time to check over everything, and then because I'm not checking and following up, the work never gets done. Well, to me, that's why I'm always emphasizing one of the core values at Mindset Go is developing processes and having a focus on that to lead to commitments. So if people don't know how to do something, if they don't know how to be organized, if they don't know how to be efficient, if they don't know how to collaborate effectively, then that's going to hinder their ability to keep commitments, because the knowledge is just as important as the skills. And then what happens when circumstances come up that interfere with people keeping their commitments? Then there becomes that doubt, right? And doubt and uncertainty start to creep in. And when it comes to trust, We've done some shows in the past on accountability and excuses just make people look weak. And I'll get some of our clients come to me and they'll say, well, but sometimes it's a real excuse. Sometimes it's a family emergency or it's a weather emergency. Look, again, it comes down to track record and precedent. If you're the kind of person that has a habit of making excuses, then even when it is a legitimate emergency, you're probably still going to be questioned fairly or unfairly. But the fact of the matter is you're going to have situations come up and obstacles that interfere with your ability to make commitments. When they do, how frequently do they happen, and how do you handle them when they do happen? And lastly, forgiveness. I think when it comes to consistency, is there a forgiveness when people make those mistakes? Is there an ability to forgive? And do you feel like you're going to be isolated or cast aside when you make that mistake that possibly loses a client for your company, that possibly creates a rift in a relationship? And that's a key element. And look, if I were to call up an HR person or a CEO today and say, hey, look, I'd like to conduct a workshop on forgiveness, I'd probably get laughed out the door. Because so much of forgiveness is internal as much as external. So they're going to sit there and hear that, and they're going to say, well, what are we going to get out of this if we invest in this forgiveness training. And the fact of the matter is it's really emotional intelligence training. And what you get out of it is two huge elements of workplace success. One is you get a more engaged team, and two, you get a more collaborative culture. And so when it comes to forgiveness, you have to look at higher level. That is one of the fundamental elements that what creates rifts in relationships. And that brings me to one of my favorite topics. And, we recently did a training at beautiful O'Neill Cinemas in Littleton. If you have not been there, it is a wonderful place. And during that training, one of the participants in the training talked about trusting her gut and knowing that we've spent so much time last week on the show and in the first segment of today's show talking about trusting others. But now we're going to shift a little bit to trusting inward and trusting your gut. And one of the challenges in trusting your gut is when you make a decision, trusting your gut directly correlates with decision making and critical thinking. Okay? So every time you make a decision, even if you've received feedback from others, you ultimately have something in your gut that's saying, okay, this is the right thing to do. So when you make decisions and critical think to lead to those decisions and they don't work out, the tendency is to say, oh, why did I do that? Or why did I trust my gut? And then people get really out of whack because then they start to second guess every decision they make, and they don't necessarily know when it's okay to trust your gut, when it isn't. But what I explained to this woman, and she was very intelligent and successful, is I said, when you're questioning whether you're trusting your gut, it's not, the answer isn't to question, do you have a good gut? The answer is to question the decision-making process and the critical thinking process that's leading up to making those decisions. And are you evaluating the right criteria? Are you talking to the right people? Those are the things you should be thinking about, among others. But when it comes to trusting your gut, we so want to believe people, even when they know what they're offering is too good to be true. So, one of them is your own decision-making, and one of them is that captainitis I referred to earlier in the show. So if you are being led by someone in your team, heck, if it's your spouse even, or a C-suite executive you work with, to question someone, even if in your gut you know this is the right decision, if you're not speaking up, think about that for a moment. What are the consequences of not speaking up? Well, as you're listening to the show, I'm sure one of the consequences is the obvious one, is that if mistakes are made when they could have been prevented, then there's going to be obvious impact to the company's bottom line, to client retention, perhaps to employee retention. I mean, there's some really obvious things, but it goes deeper than that. You are starting to create a pattern for yourself where you're questioning whether you should speak up, and every time you question it and don't speak up, it gets harder. As that habit becomes more entrenched, it becomes harder and harder to get the confidence and courage to speak up. And so it creates an internal problem as well as an external problem. But I don't think we usually give a lot of weight to the internal damage it does on ourselves. And one of my favorite topics to teach at Mindset Go is multigenerational intelligence and multigenerational communication. And what I often hear from younger generations in the workplace is they don't speak up because they don't really feel like their feedback or opinion will be valued. And so I push back and I say, well, what would happen to make your feedback and opinion feel valued where you could change your mind? And they say, well, we just don't want to be demeaned because of our age or inexperience and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, part of being an effective leader, whether it's a younger generation or your generation, is to create that culture where the feedback is valued and you can trust you will be heard. And a lot of people, when they give feedback, part of the rules and expectations they establish is they expect immediate results from the feedback. And sometimes it takes people a long time to process that feedback, and it can even take months and sometimes even years to act on the feedback. But if we don't get that instant gratification on that feedback, it feels like, well, why bother? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing goes the other direction, where if you do speak up and your opinions and thoughts aren't validated or acknowledged, and by the way, there's two parts to that. They can be validated or acknowledged in a meeting, or they can also be validated and acknowledged by following up with that person. And even if you don't embrace their idea or opinion, for you to follow up and say, hey, listen, thanks for speaking up in the meeting the other day. Whether we accept your opinion or not, we really appreciate your input and feedback. We're not going to move forward with it, but please keep it coming. That's what people need to hear. And I don't care how old you are. If you're trying to create a culture where people trust that their feedback and input is worthwhile, that's what it takes. I remember with my old company, one of the things, the culture I tried to create is we'll take feedback from the janitor. And I'm not trying to demean janitors. Janitors do great work and we need them. My point is that whether you're a fifth grader, whether you're a janitor, whatever your role is in society, you have a brain and in some way you have an experience that can probably lend wisdom to a situation. And that is the kind of culture leadership should be creating, is that when you are creating a culture where people's feedback is valued, those ideas start to flow, and it also creates a more engaged and active culture. So when we come back from our second break, we're going to continue the culture on the conversation on trusting your gut, and more discussion on a secret formula so you can know if someone truly is trustworthy. This is Mark Altman with the Mindset Go radio show. We'll be right back.